1 Samuel chapter 4, the Israelites go into battle. The Bible tells us that the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. They camped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines at Aphek. It says that the Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. So they were beaten pretty soundly. They were struggling. They were trying to process, hey, what just happened? They're talking together. And it says that when the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel, those who might have been, they were older in age, obviously elders, but they also would have been leaders, both spiritually, maybe economically, politically, so to speak. They said, why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies. Let's take the ark of God. Maybe they came up with this plan. Maybe if we go get the ark and we take the presence of God with us, God will go before us and we'll win the battle. It doesn't really appear that they consulted God about this battle or about this war. It just feels like they had an idea that they could take God and they could take God's presence and that would somehow guarantee or seal them a victory. I wouldn't recommend that in our own life or in our own walk. I want to know what God's will is, and then I want to take God's will and apply that towards my life. I don't want to try to tell God what his will should be or to use God as a tool to win a battle that God might not even want me to be in. And we'll see that just because they bring the ark doesn't mean that they're going to win. It's really, in many ways, it's a picture of how religion can kind of trip us up or trap us up. It's like, just because you have this or just because you do that doesn't mean that it's going to be effective, doesn't mean that anything's going to come from it. Just because you go through the motions doesn't mean that your heart's really right with God, if that makes sense. So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's two sons, the scoundrels, doesn't say that in the Bible, but it called them scoundrels earlier, I think in chapter 1 or 2, probably chapter 2. It just talks about how they were just bad news. These dudes were bad dudes. And Hophni and Phinehas were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, what's all the shouting in the Hebrew camp? When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. A god has come into the camp, they said. Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. Basically, they heard that the ark was there and they were terrified. They knew that they were done for. There was a fear of the Lord. There was a fear of the God of Israel. People knew. And nations heard. There's all throughout the earth, you hear this in the Old Testament, that nations knew, especially when they went into the Promised Land. And at Jericho, they said, where have y'all been? We knew y'all were coming. We've been worried about y'all for decades. We've heard the stories of what your God has done. But this story is told so that you can better understand. The story is told to show how God used the enemies, the Philistines, to deal with Hophni and Phinehas. You see Hophni and Phinehas, who we learned about earlier, treated the Lord's table with contempt, who really blasphemed the Lord and had a heart that was totally against God. They will take this ark out into battle, and they will die in the battle. It says that they said, we're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject or slaves to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. That same day, a Benjamite ran from the battle line and went to Shiloh with his clothes torn and dust on his head. He was mourning. He was sad. When he arrived, there was Eli sitting on his chair by the side of the road watching because his heart feared for the ark of God. When the man entered the town and told what had happened, the whole town sent up a cry. Eli heard the outcry and asked, what is the meaning of the uproar? The man hurried over to Eli, who was 98 years old and whose eyes had failed so that he could not see. He told Eli, I have just come from the battle line. I fled from it this day. He said, what happened, my son? The man who brought the news replied, Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man, and he was heavy. Possibly he was older and overweight. He had led Israel 40 years. He was the leader of Israel. He was, in many ways, he was like a prophet, but he was also in some ways like a judge. He was someone who would lead in Israel. He was a man of great renown. Verse 19, his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant near the time of delivery. When she heard the news that the ark of God had been captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth, but was overcome by her labor pains. As she was dying, the woman attending her said, "Don't despair, you've given birth to a son." But she did not respond or pay any attention. She named the boy Ichabod, which means no glory, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel," because of the capture of the ark of God and the death of her father-in-law and husband. She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." She would pass away in childbirth. Really what God had said in chapters prior about how God would come and deal with the wickedness of this family that was supposed to represent him. God's dealt with them. And it's a sobering story. Really, it's tragic because it was completely avoidable on their part. They could have honored God, they could have served God, and God's hand would have continued to be on their life. But they, as the Bible says, they treated the Lord's table and the Lord's offering with contempt, and they were blasphemous towards the Lord, and Eli didn't deal with his children. And this is the consequences of when we rebel against God. I don't want to sugarcoat it. It's just the truth. It says in chapter 5, after the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then they carried the ark into Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon. When the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took the ark of God, they brought it into their temple of false gods next to their god Dagon. That's what they called him. And Dagon, when they got up in the morning, was on the ground face down. The presence of God had just pushed this idol down. I don't know how God did it, but God just pushed this idol to the ground. They came and they put Dagon back up. But the following morning, when they rose, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. His head and hands had been broken off and were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. That is why to this day neither the priests of Dagon nor any others who entered Dagon's temple at Ashdod step on the threshold. I don't know if God sent an angel, if God spoke a word or what he did, but he cut off the head and the hands of their false god. And you would have thought by now they would have figured out that God was not happy with them. Verse 6, the Lord's hand was heavy on the people of Ashdod and its vicinity. He brought devastation on them and afflicted them with tumors. Basically, they had all sorts of rats in the land. There was destruction in the city. They had all sorts of wounds and tumors and boils, and basically they were getting plagued, kind of similar to like how the Egyptians were. They had taken the ark of God, and God was not happy about it. And it says when the people of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, "The ark of God of Israel must not stay here with us. Get it out of here, because his hand is heavy on us and on our Dagon, our God." So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and asked them, "What shall we do with the ark of God?" And they answered, "Have the ark of God of Israel moved to Gath." So they moved the ark of the God of Israel. But after they moved it, the Lord's hand was against that city, throwing it into a great panic. He afflicted the people of the city, both young and old, with an outbreak of tumors. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. As the ark of God was entering Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, "They brought the ark of God of Israel around us to kill us and our people." Nobody wanted the ark. Everybody was like, "Please get the ark out of our city." And it's kind of interesting how the presence of God comes to their city, and rather than humbling themselves and repenting and turning to the presence of God, they just wanted to protect and preserve their false god at all costs and their lifestyle at all costs. They weren't willing to turn to the living God. So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and said, "Send the ark of God of Israel away. Let it go back to its own place, or it will kill us and our people." For death had filled the city with panic. God's hand was very heavy on it. Those who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the outcry of the city went up to heaven. Basically, they came to the conclusion, we don't want this ark with our false gods and in our city. Get it out of here. And they sent the ark of God back into Israel, which we will learn about in our next chapter. Be blessed today.